Today I want to talk about the Garnet Herzog. There was this device by Garnet. Gillies of Garnet helped Randy Bachman build this device, or actually built it for him, because Randy Bachman, back in the old days, I think it was the 60s, was in bands, and he was back in Winnipeg, Manitoba, Canada, and he was taking one amp, a smaller amp, and cranking it up and putting the output that was supposed to go to the speaker of that amp into the input of another bigger amp. And you get this like really sustained, distorted sound that he really liked. Of course, it only lasts for a few minutes before he'd blow up the amps, or they'd get completely destroyed. So Gar Gillies of Garnet was asking him, like, what are you doing? Why are you destroying this? Because he was a repairman, and he was trying to figure out why does he keep bringing me these broken amps? And so he's like, oh, well, that's okay. That's dangerous. You shouldn't be doing that. But he helped him figure out a device. They kind of worked together to build what became known as the Herzog. So I'm always talking about the Herzog as if people know what it is. And I realize that it's very much less known in the guitar world. Maybe some people hear about it once in a while. Basically, what ended up being was just it is pretty much almost exactly a Tweed era Fender Champ with a dummy load and a line out with a variable line out that goes into the front end of whatever other amp you want to do, so that it takes its signal, safely puts it into that one. And it's because it's a kind of Tweed Champ, it can get really super distorted. I'm looking at the schematic. I do notice there's like a couple like very small capacitor value changes. So they probably were tweaking it a little bit just to get a little bit more singing and sustaining. But for the most part, the general idea is to do this one thing that you should never do. Take one tube amp and plug the speaker output of that tube amp into the front end of another tube amp. Because you're just asking for trouble. You're going to destroy most likely the first amp, I would think, and probably the second amp as well. So you're going to cause all sorts of problems. But there is a safe way to do it. And so, and it's actually quite simple. Like, people do create dummy loads all the time, and you can add a line out to your amp quite easily as well. But what if you just did that separately, externally? And so what I did was, for probably about less than $10 worth of parts, maybe a little bit more, I just took this pedal enclosure that I had, and basically all it has is like a little, and underneath this little pig here is inside is a heat sinked, I think it's a 100 watt resistor that's 16 ohms. So you can plug it into the 16 ohm output of one amp, and it works as a dummy load for that. And then it has this variable line out right here, controlled, and just to figure out just to hit the front end of the next amp with the appropriate level. So you can kind of dial it in, get your clean tone out of your main amp, and then you use this to get your distorted sound at the level at the volume that you want it. And so this is like a 1 meg potentiometer. There's a resistor in there, that there's a little capacitor that you can bypass, a little bypass capacitor on that resistor that allows you to push the high end a little bit extra by hitting that. And so then all I've added was this extra little switch, which is just it's a DP-DT. I think it's like a 3-pole dual throw, just so that I can stick a little 9-volt battery in here, and I can have LED lights on this one. I'll probably make another one without 9 volts. Just make it a little simpler, make it a little tiny more compact. Because this is for my friend Zeke, who maybe he'll want the smaller one, maybe he'll want this one. I don't know. It's up to him. But so that he has a Fender Champ, a little Vibro Champ build that he built. I have it right here. And so the idea is, he didn't ask for this, but here I'm pushing the Herzog on everybody. So like, oh, you got to try this. Why don't you use this little amp? It's a little Fender Champ. It's actually a Vibro Champ, but it has a little Tweed switch here. Basically just bypasses the treble and bass, just to give it an extra boost, basically give it a Tweed mode. And what I also have, the reason why I have it with me right now is just to fix the variable voltage regulator, put it on a little heat sink. You can see right here, It'll have a little heat sink. There's a MOSFET. Basically, it just allows you to take the plate voltage and bring the plate voltage way down, just to take the volume down. And so you can just really push the front end, and you still have a master volume, basically. You can do this on lots of amps. This one, just being a 5-watt amp, doesn't need a huge heat sink, because unfortunately this had a steel chassis, and so the MOSFET did need to dissipate some heat, but the steel powder-coated chassis was just not allowing the MOSFET to dissipate the heat enough, so it fried that MOSFET. Hopefully this heat sink is big enough to dissipate whatever this 5-watt amp can produce for that in that variable voltage regulator. But this, you can see this little part right here. This is basically the whole variable voltage regulator circuit for cathode bypass or cathode biased amps. Very basic, super useful little circuit that I absolutely love. Get your cranked tones and at like basically bedroom levels. So today what I'm going to do is I want to play with this. Let's do the Garnet Herzog. I don't have a Herzog. Probably never will get to actually play a real one. I know that they are reissuing them, so you can buy them, but knowing what they are could basically do that same idea and tweak something. I might build one, a replica someday of just that one, the actual Herzog model. But for now, what I want to play with is, let's try a few different amps, and I call this the Zog-O-Mizor. So let's like turn some amps into a Herzog. And so we'll start off with this. Ultra Champ, I think it's called, or the Vibro Champ. And what I'm going to also do is, if the amp doesn't seem to have enough gain to really get that singing thing with the amp cranked, I have potentially just any kind of little boost circuit just to push the front end of it. Here I have just a home-built rat pedal, and just to push that first amp a little bit harder, that we're Zog-O-Mizing. And so this pedal, very basically, we have our input, and then we go, and so then this switch will take the next output, either let it go right to the output over here. So this is the input, here's the output. When this is not lit up, it's just going input to output, skipping the zogged amp. But then we click this in, it's now taking this end, it's going to the front of what's going to be the first. We'll try the Champ. And then this is the speaker cable. I made sure that you can't accidentally get these cables mixed up. This is the speaker cable that'll come out of the Champ into the Zog-O-Mizor. It'll have its dummy load and its output through the volume and onto the next amp. So today I'll just try this into my steel string Singer amp right back here on the bottom, a bigger amp, just super clean amp, so that we know that we can never drive it, so we know that all the distortion's happening. It's happening in the Zog-O-Mized amp. So let's give it a try. hopefully that was helpful. I don't know if really the truth is like I'm playing through some of the Trainwreck amps into the front end of another amp. It's really like, especially that second amp being a clean amp, it really just is kind of like the natural Trainwreck sound for the most part. Probably like even a little bit hindered by having to go into something else. Probably a little less open sounding. But interestingly though, it does retain its kind of like control from the volume knob. Like when you're playing the Trainwrecks, you can basically dial back the volume and it still cleans up nicely, and you still get that effect through like a slave amp as well. So but is there any point to like Zog-O-Mizing it or Zogifying it? It'd be like basically if you just still wanted to have like a big clean amp for your clean tone and just be able to put it into it and not have to be like a separate input, like instead of running 2 amps with 2 mics on them or whatever, just in stereo or whatever, like clean and dirty, you could just be, your dirty sound would come through your clean amp, so that through the one channel basically. Also you get to add the reverb from like the steel string singer onto the end of the signal chain after like the Trainwreck amps. But yeah, so I would say it's hard to say, like, is it something that's really needed? I mean, it's fun to be able to play with by just adding this pedal. It doesn't really, all of these amps that I ran into it, I had the variable voltage regulator on all of them. And so I had them all dialed back to kind of low wattage. They probably all were kind of putting out less than 5 watts anyway, into the front of this kind of dummy load that had basically should be able to take 100 watts. I kind of doubt it, but keeping under 50 watts output level, I'm not too worried. I would feel the kind of just, I'll touch the pedal and see, because it has a big heatsink on that resistor, and I'd see if it was getting hot, and it was never even getting warm. So I wasn't hitting that dummy load very hard anyway, but yeah, I could see that potentially happening if we're running a more powerful amp into the front of this. But in any case, I kind of found, I guess the other question would be like, is it, how do they sound compared to each other? Now, none of them really got that super singing saturated sound until I also hit the front of the Zogified amp with a pedal with a bit of extra distortion on it, like the Rat. Then it would really hit that extra level of just singing, sustain, and feedback. I think a lot of these amps could do it potentially if just starting to turn the volume up more, even on the slave amp. But then as the question remains, so if you're going to use an additional pedal driving this, is it giving you something that a pedal can't do? Because I'm hitting it with maybe a bit of transistor clipping into the front of a tube amp clipping with, now all of them, they were doing their preamp and power amp of that Zogified amp. The power tubes were also distorting and stuff too. So that added a different flavor that maybe you couldn't get from a pedal, or even just from preamp drive that you normally get from, like a Marshall or something. So I guess that's the question. Is it giving a flavor that you can't otherwise get? For me, it seems like it does something, it gets it easier, but I don't know. It's one of those things where it's, you'd see whether it's worth it or not in the long term. I mean, for a pedal like this, just to be able to throw one amp in front of another amp, it's just enough fun way to be able to play with it. I don't know if I'd use it often, if it's worth in live situations for people or not, but I think some people made their living on that tone, right? Like I think that was a big part of Randy Bachman's famous guitar tone would be that Herzog sound. You think of Big Sugar, that's his sound, is the Herzog sound. So people made a living out of kind of getting that drive sound. So who knows? But thanks for joining me on this journey, kind of experimenting. I don't know how many of those clips I'm going to keep in there because I don't want to make it seem really long, and how bad it was just noodling around without really thinking about it. But yeah, thanks for joining me, and that was the journeying through a Zog-O-Mizor pedal, playing with the idea of a Herzog amp. Okay, see you next time.